Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs, and I'm the Programs Manager here at the library. Is anyone visiting the library for the first time tonight? Yes, one person, two, three. Three people. Fantastic. That's enough for me to give you a brief spiel. We have been in operation for over 100 years. We're the largest English language lending library on the European continent. And over our history, we have been the home to figures such as Hemingway, Stein, Edith Wharton, and we remain a living cultural center today, hosting authors, artists, journalists, and curators to speak about their brilliant work. So tonight, it is such a pleasure to be hosting Lou Stoppard and Lauren Collins as they discuss Lou's absolutely brilliant, incredibly triumphant, successful exhibit, Exteriors, Annie Ernaux, and Photography. Just a couple of notes about this conversation. After about 45 minutes, we're going to open it up to questions from our in-person audience, and if we have time from our Zoom audience as well. So if you have a question and you're on Zoom, put it in the chat, and if you're in the room, just sit tight and raise your hand when we tell you to. And copies of Exteriors, Annie Ernaux, and Photography, which has been published by MACK, are going to be available for purchase following this event, and Lou may even sign a copy or two, so I highly encourage you to purchase it. On to our brilliant speakers tonight. Lou Stoppard is a British writer and curator. She has written for the Financial Times, Aperture, the New York Times, and the New Yorker. Her books include a survey of the work of street photographer Shirley Baker, published by MACK in 2019, Pools, an exploration of swimming in photography, published by Rizzoli in 2020, and the book that we are going to be discussing tonight, Exteriors, Annie Ernaux, and Photography, published in 2024, to time with the exhibition of the same name at the Maison Européenne de la Photographie, which is slightly challenging for me to say. In conversation with Lou tonight is the wonderful Lauren Collins, who has spoken at the library many times before. Lauren began contributing to The New Yorker in 2003 and became a staff writer in 2008. Her subjects have included Michelle Obama, Donatella Versace, the graffiti writer Banksy, Emmanuel Macron, the refugee crisis, equal pay, and most recently, an absolutely delightful, delicious, grotesque article about the history, philosophy, and notable instantiations of all-you-can-eat buffets in France and abroad, which I have sent to everyone in my contact list. It's absolutely wonderful. I highly encourage you all to read it. Lauren has been based in Paris since 2015, covering stories from mainly in France, and she is the author of When in French, Love in a Second Language, which the Times named as one of its 100 notable books of 2016. Showing at la Maison Européenne de la Photographie, now through May 26th, Exteriors, Annie Ernaux, and Photography traces the relationship between Annie Ernaux's autobiographical prose and the medium of photography. And this program was produced in collaboration with MEP and with MACK, so thank you so much to them, and please go and see the wonderful exhibit as well. You can even see it on Tuesdays now, which did not used to be a possibility, and they open another day of the week just to accommodate the amount of visitors that want to see the show. So it's a huge success. Lou, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Congratulations again on this beautiful show, this beautiful book. I will leave the rest to you too. Give me a round of applause, please.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight. We're so lucky Lou is in Paris, one night only. And congratulations on all the success the show has had. It's wonderful. I hope you all have the opportunity to see it. Just to orient you in terms of what we're going to be talking about, so the relationship between this book, Exteriors in English, it's in French, it's Journal du Dehors, right?
Really glad you said that.
And it was published in 1993, is that right? This is, so Annie Ernaux's book. Lou, this is the book that Lou, in collaboration with, are we calling it MEP? I want to.
MEP is easier to say, yes, MEP.
MEP. This is the catalog that goes along with the exhibition that Lou conceived and curated, and there's a great essay in this book. And the conceit of the exhibition is, you know, Annie Ernaux's book is already concerned with photography, so Lou read it and intelligently thought, why not curate an exhibit with photography and, you know, see how the media play together. So Annie Ernaux's stated intention in Exteriors is to describe modernity, and I'm quoting now, through a series of snapshots reflecting the daily routine of a community. And so you had the idea to supplement these with photographs, sort of piling snapshots onto snapshots, you know, cliches onto cliches, if we're going the French way. But did you worry ever about creating a sort of like double negative, if you will? Like, talk about how you, you know, thought to take this book that is concerned with photography and then to go, you know, to take actual images and layer them on top of what Annie Ernaux had decided to do.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a challenge in several ways. One of which was, well, maybe to zoom out first. So when we say that the book is concerned with photography, like it is and it isn't at the same time. There's a kind of looseness to Annie's approach to photography, which runs across all of her writing. You know, like she often references photography, often in quite strange and unexpected ways. So, you know, she'll refer to her memories as images, or she'll sort of insert a description of a photograph of herself into a book, or a photograph of her family, or she'll describe sort of episodes from her past as scenes, so very photographic language. But in this book, as you say, like she kind of explicitly references photography at the beginning of the book. There's a little essay at the start, and she talks about trying to write as if through the eyes of a photographer, and then she makes these descriptions, so it kind of moves away from photography but kind of stays in photography, because to me those descriptions were like images. So there was obviously the sense of kind of treating those as an image, as you say, what's going to happen when you do that, and how can you avoid it screaming like this is a text, and how do you avoid sort of any imagery, like actual photography that you put alongside the text feeling like illustrations? How do you stop the text feeling like captions? That was a real process. And I should say the project didn't begin as an exhibition, it began as a residency at the MEP. So when I first read Exteriors, I sent what I actually haven't read it back, but I think it was probably quite a sort of unhinged and very enthusiastic email to Simon Baker, who's the director of MEP, and I said, this book, someone should have done something within a photography space. I really want to come and do some research. The MEP has an amazing collection of photography, and I said, can I come and spend some time? And at this point, I didn't know if it was going to be like a talk or if it was going to be an essay. And Simon said, yes, actually, we're starting a residency, come. And then I spent a month looking at all the photography in the MEP collection. And it was kind of through that process that I think, to answer your question, the sort of ability to avoid it being like a double negative happened, because I started to think of Annie as an image maker with a style of image making, both like a visual style, like a sort of visual perspective, but also with a certain intentions and preoccupations. And I managed to relate that to different image makers. And I really thought of it as like a group show, and she was a photographer amongst that.
Well, it's so interesting because, I mean, it's a simple conceit, but an extraordinary result. I mean, you read a book like this, and I think so many people would be tempted to think, well, I can write down snatches of, you know, life or vignettes or overheard conversation, but, you know, it wouldn't be as good.
No.
How does Annie Ernaux manage to take us somewhere different with that? And yeah, well, simple question, go for it.
I think there's several things going on in the book. So it's written across 7 years. So part of it is that you get such a sense of time passing in a particular moment. It's written from like mid-90s to early 80s. So it's a particular moment within French culture, but also within sort of Western modernization. So you see that process of Cergy-Pontoise, like a new town kind of develop, and the sense of kind of consumerism and advertising and all of that. So there's a real sense of kind of a moment in time. Annie's a very funny writer. I think that's something that doesn't get discussed about her work enough. Some of her descriptions are incredibly amusing.
Tell us about something that made you laugh.
There's just, I mean, we were talking about it just before, but like I became pregnant when I was working on this show, and there's like a description of a pregnant woman like selling makeup in a shop, and she describes her as like daffy and swollen in the way that pregnant women are. And I was like, oh. But it's also like a very it's a sort of she's very good at reading people. And there's some descriptions that are so close between funny and deeply sad. Like there's another pregnant woman actually, there's a description of a young girl kind of amongst a crowd of boys. And she kind of catches a comment from the girl where she's chatting to one of the lads and she says, "Oh, they don't know that I'm like 2 months pregnant by you, do they?" And it's kind of really, like the way she's so flippant about it, it's kind of disarming, but it's kind of witty at the same time, in the way that those snippets of conversations you hear from teenagers can be so jarring, but also very amusing at the same time. So I think that's something that's wonderful about Annie's writing, but also it is the sense of her remarkable ability to capture reality and her fascination with reality. And that's, to use Annie's own words, you know, it's something she speaks about very beautifully in her Nobel Prize lecture, you know, being fascinated by reality and the sensations provided by reality. And they're two different things. And I think that's what's really happening within her text. It's reality, but also the sensations provided by reality. And I think that's why people connect with it, because they feel that.
Well, your books both open with a citation from Rousseau, which is, "Our real self is not entirely inside us." Can you talk a little bit about what you think that means to Annie and what it means to you as well?
I think what it means to Annie is that, I mean, this is kind of her whole project with the years, which is about how a life can be tracked through, you know, the style of belt that you bought, or the songs that you listen to on the radio, or images from popular culture, and how all those images will disappear, and thus your life, and in part your inner life, will kind of fade with it. And it's something she also talks about within Exteriors. She describes how she puts so much more of herself into these kind of extracts than she intended, because what she notices and what she chooses, like what she is touched by, says a lot about, you know, about herself. And she kind of equates, you know, why does something catch her eye? Is it because it reminds her of a relative, or it reminds her of herself? So there's a sense of it being sort of what we notice telling a story about the self. And that's a constant conversation within photography, right? You know, why do you see what you see? And what I quite liked about this project is it's kind of a cliched conversation within photography. You know, if I spoke, when I'd begun this project, if I went to someone who was kind of serious about photography and a photography scholar, and I said, "Oh, I want to do something about images and reality, or images being self-portraits," they'd be like, "Oh, okay, like, are we in high school? Like, these are not interesting concepts in photography," but they are. And I think this allowed me to think about them in a kind of different way.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was fascinating is, I think this interview is in the catalog, but, you know, this idea of writing like a photographer. I mean, she, you know, initially approaches it thinking in this kind of, you know, like you said, like, have you read Sontag, or this idea that writing like a photographer would allow her to be
Neutral.
more objective. Yeah. Inaccessible is the word she uses, and I think Lou really brilliantly interpreted that to mean kind of pure, or I wasn't sure what to make of that actually when I read Inaccessible.
But she means like it doesn't invite you in, like there's not a kind of justifications and moralizing and explanation in the way that writing can often,
like, fenced off in a way. Inaccessible in the term of right. But yeah, so this was her initial idea with the project. And then an interview I was reading, I can't remember if it was actually your interview, Lou, or another one, but she said, well, you know, looking back, I think I put so much of myself into this, and maybe, you know, maybe I misunderstood what the project was, or I would have done it differently, either by acknowledging, you know, how much of my own subjectivity is going into what I'm writing, or by, I don't know, marking the parameters differently and trying to make, you know, rules for herself that that would prevent so much of her own experience from seeping in. Which, I mean, we can probably all agree that's a doomed project. But yeah, did you talk to her? Because Lou also, I mean, as part of Lou's residency and as part of her project, she was able to consult with Annie Ernaux herself and to, you know, have a dialogue with her about this. So you have kind of the latest version of that. What can you tell us Just tell us about some of the things that the two of you talked about.
It's a really good question that you're asking, because it was something that Annie and I discussed, this thing of her putting interpretations into the descriptions, and I did ask her about it. The bit that you're referencing was, there's a similar bit within the essay. I said, but hang on, Annie, you talk about kind of capturing things in this inaccessible way, but you do often present kind of speculate on people's motivations. So there's a description of like a mother and daughter on the train, and Annie describes that they're performing their good relationship because they enjoy kind of performing a mother-daughter relationship. And I asked her about that, and she said, well, you know, if I did it again, I wouldn't do that. And it was almost like, yeah, like she felt like she'd failed within
one
her
thing
project.
that I think is interesting is, I mean, I got the feeling that you, and I know I did as well, found that gloss on their interaction slightly unpersuasive.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure that that was what they're doing, what they were doing. So then you think, well, why is Annie Ernaux seeing it that way? Why is she capturing it that way? Why is she, you know, preserving it for posterity that way? Do you think, I'm curious about this, do you think there was a disingenuousness to the project of saying, you know, I'm going to write as a photographer and take the most inaccessible approach? Or do you think she actually thought she could do that and then, you know, changed her mind later? Where?
I don't think it was disingenuous. I think she thought she could do it, but I think it goes back to that quote from her Nobel lecture where she talks about reality and the sensations provided by reality. Because I think what she's capturing, and it's about different kinds of truth, because what she's capturing within that mother-daughter interaction, it's not just what is happening, it's the sensation of what's happening, the sensation of kind of, you talked about it being disingenuous or that sort of performative gloss. So I think she's trying to capture a feeling, which is when you are in public space and you can tell that someone is performing or being a little bombastic or being a little showing off, you know, it's that feeling and that mood. And I think that's what what's happening there. And I think what's so interesting about Annie as a writer is she's not afraid to kind of fail within her projects, and it's something that's really fascinating about her writing, because she often describes what she's trying to do with her writing. So she'll describe that she's trying to remember something accurately, or she's trying to summon a certain feeling, and then she'll kind of discuss that process and whether it's working or not. And it's really interesting to me to find a writer who can talk about the writing process and it not feel really dense or really academic, you know, and the fact that her work can be so inviting, I think, is because it is really about her sort of grappling with truth, reality, memory, and going through a process that we all do, which is kind of questioning our own reactions to things and our own memories and our own reads on things, and wondering about whether they're accurate or whether they're biased or whether they've morphed over time. And I think that's sort of what she's doing here. She's grappling with reality and actually thinking about her text in terms of reality sort of made the project more for me. And rather than it being about sort of bringing text together with photography, it sort of became about fragments of reality, which, to go back to what we were talking about sort of photographic cliches, like there's a Susan Sontag quote where she talks about photographs, it's like the most quoted thing on photography, where she talks about photographs not sort of seeming like pieces of the world rather than representations of the world. And if you were writing like an article for any photographic magazine and you tried to put that quote in there, they would be like, what are you doing? But then I put that quote in the essay, and I kind of found it funny to do that, because to publish a photography book with that quote in is, but it became a part of how I interpreted Annie's work, which is she is kind of trying to summon those pieces of reality. And I liked thinking about the photography, and it's sort of kind of made me optimistic about photography, and sort of think about the kind of a purity to it, which goes back, I think, to Annie's word, the inaccessible.
Well, and she's also, I mean, she gives you hints that she's a little wiser to, you know, some of the underlying discourse than she might be letting on in this text. I mean, one of the things I thought was so poignant that I loved is, you know, you're constantly getting these kind of snippets of dialogue on the wind, and you know that she is more alive to them than other people, because she says, this is the speech of a vanished world. This is the way my parents talked, and nobody else hears it. You have her ears perk up when she hears these kind of like ancient locutions, or these idioms or these words that belong to a different place, a different time, and a different class. And I don't know, I found it so touching the way that, even if the actual content of the speech wasn't anything very thrilling or charming even, there was something, that she was just so attuned to. And so I feel like she does, seed little hints that she knows that, this project is actually an extremely personal one.
And that
in
she's
public
there as well, because that's what's really interesting in the book to me is like, and I tried to represent that within the photography within the show, and the Met team were really amazing in sort of what they pointed me towards within the collection and the things that they suggested, because I really wanted there to be a sense of some of the works the photographer feels completely like they're invisible, like the Harry Callahan works in Aix-en-Provence, which opposite the big hero.
Those are my favorite. We're gonna have to talk about those. I mean, can you actually,
but he's kind of hidden, like he's kind of hiding in shadows while he makes those works.
Just explain to the people who haven't seen the show. I think we'll talk about Harry Callahan now, and then about your approach to choosing the photographs at greater length later. But just what are the Harry Callahan works?
So they're works that he made. He was on secondment doing like a year in France, and he made these works of people. To me, they're kind of works about errands, like people are kind of moving through public space and crossing a square or going to the rotisserie, and like he kind of hides himself like in shadows and captures these moments where people move between like dark and light. And to me, they're so fragmented, like they're about kind of this snippet of time, so they really suited.
And they're like really crisp and stylized and kind of not at all, quaint or what you would expect.
Well, Annie doesn't like the picturesque. Like when we met really early and I talked to her about the project, and at this point I had no idea if I was gonna like do just French photography or just photography from the time that she wrote exteriors, and I was kind of going back and forth, and she sort of quipped about some sort of, we were talking about like French street photography, and it was immediately clear that would not be, I mean, there are French photographers within the show. There's a fair number actually, and some of them are ones that Annie is very attached to. Like when I showed her the photography, like Janine Niepce, she really connected with that work. But that's where the sense of making it broad. So to answer your question, like the work within the show, the earliest work is from the 1940s, and it's through to work that was made just a few years ago. And there's a real mix. There's French stuff, there's stuff from the US, there's stuff from Japan, Singapore, Italy.
Well, I mean, Lou, so once you realized this was going to be a show, what did you have, a month here, 2 months? And so you kind of roll up your sleeves and you're in this voluminous archive. How did you start? And then, I know you started with street photography, right? Yeah. But where that quickly took you elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work in the MEP collection, so it was a real challenge. And the collections team there, Pascal and Frédéric, were really, really helpful, because they sort of suggested a few people to look at, and I sort of started there. And there's some stuff that I knew was in the collection already, like I knew that they had the Callahan works and Winogrand works and Henry Wessel. So I sort of started with some familiar stuff, and then there's quite a usable database. So a lot of it was kind of searching.
So what were your keywords?
Probably like boulangerie,
elevator,
or like metro. No, but like look at
sidewalk.
It sounds really obvious, but looking for works that were taken on trains, that became a thing. And I really liked the idea of works that were about kind of looking, so people looking at each other, and then I would find a photographer, and then I would go away in the evening and I would kind of research that photographer and find other photographers that were connected, and then I'd check if they were in the collection. And then Simon, who's the MEP director, would suggest stuff to me. So this was kind of after we decided it would be a show. He was like, "Oh, we've got this, why didn't you look at that?" And so it sort of just developed. I mean, actually, it's kind of interesting, because the work that I looked at in that early period, it is quite similar to what's in the show. 'Cause some stuff got cut, but there is like a really nice through line. which I think was important to that sense of it being developed through these conversations with Annie.
Well, I loved your, you were thinking of it as kind of a day in town, right?
Yeah.
And which is like, it is a dated notion in a way, and that so many of those, and I love your interest in errands. Errands are so interesting. Now, so many errands, it's interesting because this book, first of all, not only was it written before the advent of social media, but it was also written before the ubiquity of like personal cameras, online shopping, everything. But there's something about the classic rhythm of a day in town that is still so primordial. So how did you translate that to the show?
Well, so when we first started talking about, how it moved from just being a research project into the show, Victoria, who's the curator I work with at MEP, she was like, you need to make it more thematic. And I was quite resistant to that at the beginning because I was like, no, it's about sort of haphazard encounters. But actually she was really correct with that, like this idea of sort of having, like that's why the opening room, you get this sense of sort of moving from a private world into a public world. So I think we've called it interior, exterior, that room. So it's kind of, there's a lot of works where you see people kind of looking through windows or sort of moving in and out of doorways. So to me, and then I had this idea of it being like, okay, so that's us leaving our house. And then the next room, you're kind of confronted by the sensory overload of a visual environment, particularly the kind of darkness of an urban environment. That there's a real undertone of that within exteriors, homelessness, inequality. So that's where you have like Moriyama and Mahamparisa. And then there's the really long room in the map. So that kind of made sense for it being you get on the train. So there's a bit where you kind of take the subway. And then in the next space, that's really where you're kind of doing your shopping. You're going to a restaurant. You're kind of engaging with leisure culture. And then the last room is really about kind of people watching. And it's about how we, I guess, analyze ourselves through comparison and through, like looking at people and watching people perform their identity, whether it's their sort of gender identity or whether it's their class or their status. And then the final work in the show, you can't control which way people go around a space, but to me, what is the final work in the show is a Van der Kerken work of a train line. So it's the sense that we get back on the train at the end and we go home.
Well, and you mentioned at one point these public spaces and these kind of in-between spaces. Platforms, sidewalks. Supermarkets. Like, talk to me about your interest in that and how, what you see as the relationship between Annie Ernaux's writing and the photographs that you chose.
Well, Annie's obsessed with these kind of, in-between spaces, so particularly supermarkets. She actually wrote a sort of similar book to Exteriors, another visual diary called Look at the Lights, My Love, which is just interactions within a supermarket. And that's something a mother says to a child in the shop. She's like, look at the lights, my love. And it's a really beautiful title.
The supermarket to her is something really distinct. It's not just a place it's really distinct in, class and purpose and everything because there are scenes, vignettes from the butchers here too. And there's something very different, going to the supermarket to buy your food and going to the butcher to buy your food means something very different to her. Talk about, I don't even know if supermarket, I think it's hypermarket that she's really, tell us about the importance of the hypermarket.
Well, I think to her, it's about modernity. It's about kind of, she's very interested in consumer culture and consumption and advertising. So I think the supermarket, you really get that sense of sort of an overload of modernity. And this, this is also a project about modernity. Like Cergy is a new town and she's trying to capture the feeling of life within a new town. She describes it as being like sprung up from nowhere, bereft of memories. And she's not like snooty about Cergy. It's where she lives. It's where she still lives now. But there's definitely a sense of her being fascinated by kind of the pace of modern life.
And also she's making an argument that it merits documentation.
Yeah,
right?
There's a quote which I'm kind of like desperately trying to find, but she says, I believe that desire, frustration, and social and cultural inequality are reflected in the way we examine the contents of our shopping trolley or in the words we use to order a cut of beef or to pay tribute to a painting. that the violence and shame inherent in society can be found in the contempt a customer shows for a cashier, or in the vagrant begging for money who is shunned by his peers, in anything that appears to be unimportant and meaningless simply because it is familiar or ordinary. And then she says, our experience of the world cannot be subject to classification. In other words, the feelings and thoughts inspired by places and objects are distinct from their cultural content. Thus, a supermarket can provide just as much meaning and human truth as a concert hall. So, I mean, it's what she says. You know, like there's a sense of life happens in these places and that merits documentation. And that is something that really connects her to a lot of the photographers within the show. You know, it's the fascination with reality, but also the fascination with spaces or moments of living that were often kind of dismissed. And you can draw a line to William Klein, but you can also draw a line to someone like Barbara Alper, who made works of television reportage. You know, there's a sense, I mean, Annie joked about it with me. She was like, they call me the queen of the supermarket. And there's a snootiness about, you know, critics have kind of dismissed her for documenting these places and the communities within them, in the same way some of the photographers within the show, at the points that they started making work, were dismissed in, you know, not always exactly the same, but with a similar sense of it being low, you know, and it being unworthy.
Which doesn't always happen when Michel Houellebecq, for example, writes about Picard or writes about frozen food. I mean, there's a gender component to that. It's interesting. I mean, I went back, so the Rousseau quote, actually, I wanted to know what the full quote was, and it has a beginning to it, which is, our sweetest existence is relative and collective, and our true self is not entirely in us. Such is man's constitution in this life that he never succeeds in truly enjoying himself without the help of other people. So I just thought there was like an interesting tension between this idea of, you know, solidarity and interconnectedness, and then Ernaux's idea about her technique, that she was going to, you know, be so independent in documenting that, like, to assiduously keep this distance.
But she doesn't keep there's a great text which is hung in the second rim, and it's quite violent, the text, because she's sort of anonymous through the book, and then sometimes she kind of inserts herself, and you kind of remember that she's there, in the same way that some photography gives you that sense where you're like, where was the image maker in that? But she says, she's describing this kind of quite strange scene where it's like a lad and his girlfriend talking about how he wants to be cremated and not buried, and then she says, I'm visited by other people in their lives like a whore. And it's a really interesting text, because she's kind of flipping this sense of her looking into it being her kind of being marked by things. And it made me think, and I kind of discussed this probably more eloquently because I had time within the book, but thinking about her not just as a photographer, but also like almost like a piece of film, like something that could be marked by these interactions. And she describes her work in another book called Things Seen in a similar way. So it's almost like she's imprinted. And that's something that also, you know, she's fascinated by, this sense of marks. You know, it's something she writes about, being interested in stains or bruises, you know, life leaving a mark.
Fluids,
yeah, like semen stain. I mean, there's a Henry Wessel photograph of a bruise within the show, which is kind of like a little nod, I guess, to that. Yeah.
but I mean, I think you're really persuasive and incisive thesis is that all of this, her interest in the medium, has something to do with dignity, if I'm understanding correctly. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, it's something that we talked about when I first met with Annie. She talked about part of the reason that she wants to record the things that she does is to give a sense of, as you say, dignity through the act of observation, so giving weight to things. And she describes things in quite a physical way, which also relates to photography, because photographs are objects as well as images. You know, she uses the phrase she used to me, which I think she has also used in her writing, is this idea of stones. She talked about like setting stones down. And she also, it's kind of strange image, but I really liked it. She described this sense of like time racing by and things disappearing in time, like reality slipping and trying to tear away at that reality. So it is a sense of like saving things, and that is such a tender and respectful and loving process, this idea of wanting, and those are very sentimental words, which is kind of wrong for Annie because she's not really, I don't know, maybe they're right for her, but she, yeah, it is a sense of trying to save things. I know that sounds really wrought, but I think that is a process of giving dignity to things. And again, that really relates to a lot of the photographers within the show, a sense of giving dignity and weight to something through the process of observation.
One of the questions that you posed to yourself at the beginning of the project involved the expectations and the ideals that we bring to various media, whether that be photography or writing. And you wrote, "What does it mean to see as if through the eyes of a photographer? And could you say that in exteriors, Ernaux was actually making images rather than writing text?" So where do you come down on that now, having spent a couple of years steeped in this material?
Well, it's difficult because I think kind of as I said before, I think I kind of in the end abandoned the sense of like, I found a kind of middle space where I was like, this isn't a text, this isn't a photo, and all the works in the show became images to me. And images is a word that Annie uses. You know, the first line of the years is all the images will disappear. And what she's talking about with that word is it's a really loose and complex and beautiful sense of what an image is. It sits somewhere between like a memory, a piece of reality, a fragment of time. And I guess that's how I started to think about all the works together, is it was as Annie's version of an image. So it really kind of did connect to the years a lot, this project for me, because it's a word that she gives incredible complexity to. So I think, yeah, all of the works kind of meshed in my head, and became these images of reality, I guess. These kind of, I keep doing that because I'm like, it's a stone. But like, I don't know, it just kind of became, and actually it's all the more interesting. I mean, I quickly went to the space today and I was looking through it, and it doesn't work when it's empty. Like, the exhibition really relies on having visitors there, because the whole premise of the project relies on the works being encountered and kind of observed and interacted with, because for something to transcend kind of the form that you would sort of imagine it to be, it needs to be viewed and seen. So I feel it feels really special to me to be in the space when people, and that's something Annie writes about as well, and she's written a book on photography called L'usage de la photo, which is about to be translated into English, but she talks about that process of, for things to become images, they have to be kind of engaged with. So I guess it doesn't really, what I'm trying to say in a not very eloquent way, is it doesn't really matter what I think they are. What matters is what other people kind of think and presume when they walk through the exhibition or read the book.
I feel like that is the perfect note to end our part of the conversation on, because I know we're running out of time. I'm sure some of you have questions. How are we doing that? Do you?
Yes, can we have a round of applause first, please? If you have a question, we'll start with our in-person audience, so raise your hand very high and I will bring you the microphone. I thought I saw a hand raised in the front that has now gone down. Aha, there's one.
So I'm wondering a few things, but I'll start and maybe pick something up later. But do you know how much Annie Ernaux edited her own work, because she's dealing with a moment in time when she sees this, and then how much redoing does she do in the process of coming up with a fixed paragraph or page?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one, someone actually asked me this the other day and I didn't have a satisfactory answer, and I cannot remember if it's because I never asked Annie, which would be quite a big oversight, or whether somewhere in the last 2 years the answer has left my mind. She definitely does condense it. I mean, she kind of refers to that at the beginning of the book. I don't know how much kind of reordering she did, like whether there was a process of kind of sequencing, because the book is, as I'm sure you know, it's ordered by years. And you do get a sense of like seasons changing. So I didn't get the impression that she sort of really reordered things, but she's definitely kind of cut things out. It's her diary, so there's a sense of her, and it's an interesting question as well, because that is also something that Annie does in her writing, is kind of like, you know, she'll turn a diary into a book and then change the form later. You know, it's something she's done with kind of Simple Passion, where that moment in time has appeared in different books in different forms. So sometimes as diary entries, other times as a sort of written text. So that process of sort of, I don't know how much I'm answering your question, but I that process of going back on one's memories, but also on one's recordings of one's memories. And there's a photographer within the show, Henry Wessel, who did a really similar thing. So his project is called Incidents, and he goes through years of his photography and kind of makes connections between things, and creates this new body of work out of past imagery. And to me, it wasn't just the works themselves that were really relevant, it was that process, that idea of going back and then looking for connections and moments of sort of impact or importance, and then creating something new. Like, that felt like a very Annie Ernaux-ish thing. Because I think there's a bit of a sorry, I'm answering a lot of questions with my answer. Many of them you didn't actually ask me. But I think some people presume that the show would just be like pure documentary photography, that it would just be kind of work that was like instantaneous. But actually, some of the work that I think most relates is work that it's about kind of how it was made, or the ways in which the body of imagery came to be. Yeah. Sorry. Okay.
Hello. I was wondering what role you think French culture and Frenchness plays in the book specifically, but also Annie's other writing. It always seems like such a part of the story to me. So seeing the exhibition, it was super interesting to see such an international array of photographers.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the book is very specific to a moment in French culture, and it is very French in that sense. It's not Parisian, it's very French. And that's something that I did want to acknowledge within the show. I think I was also keenly aware that I am not French. I live in London, I'm English. And what I connected to in the book was a sense of a new town. And this is something that I write about in the essay, so I won't go into it too much. But I grew up very near a new town in the UK called Milton Keynes. Oh, did you? Centre MK, woo. But I, so her description of kind of like modernity and this like secular way of living, that to me felt something that could be understood universally. So that's why there's such a, well, that's not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons there's such an international mix of photographers. But also there's the sense, I think, of trying to pay tribute to that Frenchness within her writing, but also trying to look at what she's saying about time and about community and how these relate, you know, within France but beyond. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything to say on Frenchness as a expert on Frenchness?
No, I think you said it perfectly, Lou.
Other questions?
Hi. I was wondering, how long, when you were interviewing Annie, did she talk about, I mean, when she talks about her dad, or if is there anything that kind of goes out of the lines that she kind of told you? Anything you can tell us? You know? I mean, how many times did you see her? I mean, it's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing.
I think you also have to tell the breastfeeding anecdote.
I don't like. So I was very lucky because so Annie, we met at first, and then we kind of fell into a correspondence, which was kind of necessary because my French is terrible. So it's actually much easier for me to write to her, because then I could like translate it, and then she would write back in French. So it kind of got us through the necessary language barrier. But as I said, I had a child in the process of working on the show, and I breastfeed my child, and Annie found that very fascinating because she didn't breastfeed her children, and we had quite a lot of long conversations about breastfeeding. I don't know if that's like the scoop you were hoping for.
I love that you said she kept introducing you and saying, "This is Lou. She's the fabulous curator, and she's breastfeeding."
Yeah, so she was really impressed that I'd like breastfed for so long. So I remember when the show opened, my daughter was like 7 or 8 months.
That's also the answer about Frenchness. No.
But she literally, I can't remember who it was to, but she was like, and she's still breastfeeding. I was like, thank you. No, but it was kind of interesting actually talking about the kind of motherhood thing, because Annie, and she spoke about this really beautifully at like the press view for the exhibition. So I don't know if this has been quoted already in some of the interviews she did around the show, but she talked about how her process of like writing exteriors, like her kids had grown up, she was out of her marriage, and she could kind of see again, she could engage with the world. She was like a free woman in that sense, and she was able to move through public space and look at things and be present and have the kind of headspace and the independence to do that. And that was really fascinating to me, because I knew that was an aspect of the book when I started the project, but I was kind of free and independent. And then having a child, like I really understood how ravenous she is to look at things, because now when I'm out, like I never look at anything because I'm just looking at my child, you know, or checking that we've got everything we need, or like, oh, we've dropped a sock, oh no, where's the nappy bag, you know, like you're so not present in the world in that same way. And that's something that Annie and I talk about a lot, actually, like the sense of being kind of slightly removed from the world by motherhood. And I think it is a really important context to her writing that book, was that sense of these things weren't mundane to her because she could engage with them after a long period of not being able to engage with them. And like, I long to go to the supermarket on my own and just look at people, because life becomes very different, you have kids.
I thought that was totally fascinating to learn. Also, just that, like, to remember that in different moments of life, your permeability or your kind of like openness or, porousness to other people changes. And that, I don't know, the way you wrote about that and the way she wrote about that, I thought was incredibly interesting and correct, that she felt that she was like first physically out. I mean, she's like on public transport, she's like jogging up the stairs, and she's free, but also that she was just vulnerable isn't really quite the word, but just that there was like a sense of, fluidity between her and others. Again, I found so interesting, and I think you're so right to emphasize that context for the book.
Well, I just felt it firsthand, and I think that was, and actually it's interesting because in the book there are quite a few descriptions of mothers with their children, and I think that's because she was probably so keenly aware. Like, there's a really great one of a little girl getting like more and more het up when she's reading a book, and then she just turns to her mum and she's like, I want to bite you. And I think she's really good at these moments of kind of...
And that's another one of those moments where she makes a pretty strong intervention, because before the little girl loses it and has her meltdown, she goes, and this always leads to a meltdown. Then...
It's very true. Like, and there's an image in the show that Annie really liked. I mentioned this already, but Janine Niepce, there's an image of a mother and a child, and it kind of became a symbol of the show, I think, because in it, a mother's standing at the window and she's holding her kid, and Annie observed, and it sounds really obvious, but just hearing her say it kind of made that photograph seem a lot more important. She said, the child is looking at the mother, but the mother is looking out at the world. And I think that kind of became a symbol for what it's a project about seeing, as well as it being about recording. It is about looking and observation.
We had more questions.
There's one up in the front.
I think there was one back here.
Oh, sorry.
Too, that it's gone away. Okay, I'm coming back up here.
Hello, thank you so much. That was great. I wanted to ask a question that's similar to maybe the first one, about memory. And Annie writes a lot about memory. And so I was wondering, how do you incorporated memory into the exhibit and the my second question is about how do you think your memory and your images have been incorporated into the exhibit?
Memory. Okay. So there's a photographer called Mohamed Barita who has two works in the kind of second section of the show. And they're staged images, which I think, again, going back to what I said before, kind of surprises people because they feel that it wouldn't make sense for it to be like documentary observation. And to me, those works are really about memory because they're about kind of cliches of the suburbs of Paris, of the banlieue. It's from a series called Périphérique. And to me, he's trawling through stereotypes and visual cliches and things he's seen, I'm sure, in media and newspapers, television, and has encountered in his own life, and creates these moments. And I think, again, going back to what I was saying about Henry Wessel, photographers who had that kind of process of revisiting images and trying to kind of author new images through them, that felt very apt. In terms of my own memory, which isn't getting increasingly worse because when you have a baby, you lose the ability to remember basic facts. You have this uncanny thing. I get this when I'm talking where I'm like, did I literally make that point already? Like, even in the space of like a hour-long discussion, it's very troubling. Sleep deprivation. In terms of my own memory, I think it relates to this thing of being from a new town. Like, there is a particular kind of energy to those spaces. And I remember first reading Exteriors and getting like the air of what she's describing, like the stores, and like Milton Keynes, there's tons of roundabouts, and that sense of kind of driving. And this quote, she says, like, it being a place like sprung up from nowhere and like bereft of memories, that I totally got what she meant, but also being very attached to the place. Like, I feel connected to the sense of kind of aspiration that I had there, you know, how glamorous like the shopping centre felt to me, and that sort of act of consumption felt like an ability to kind of assert oneself, and these things that Annie describes, these ways that we sort of find dignity in place and a sense of status for ourselves, often at points where we potentially don't have that. I think there was something in that with me that I connected with. But the show is very much not about me. So if you're going looking for that, there's not that much there.
We have time for one final question. Yes.
Thank you. I have a question about the beginning of your project. Like, what interests me the most? Why did you choose this book, and not because I think Annie Ernaux has like books about everything. Actually, you know, you can find like about family, about I don't know, aging, about love, like everything. So you choose this book particularly about cities, that like you mentioned, but probably. Do you remember like your very first idea when you chose this book, or probably you were hesitating between different books?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think for me, the reason I chose this book is because when I'd first started reading Annie's work, I was interested in how she would make regular references to photography. And it was something that I felt was kind of under-analysed about her writing. So when I read like big profiles of her, or you know, big essays about her writing, there are very few references to photography, and the references that were there were quite accidental. So they would, I mentioned this in the essay, people would use language relating to photography. They would say like, oh, she paints a snapshot of, or she tries to stop time. So I think I found that really interesting. But in her other books, photography is kind of like a catalyst for the writing. So she'll refer to an image of herself or an image of her dad, or her on holiday, and she'll describe it. But the reason I chose this book is because she has a distinct approach within this one. She wants the words to be images. So it's different to her kind of referencing a photograph and then describing it in text. Here it's like she was trying to produce imagery. So it was really, I mean, yes, it's about a city, and in a sense of like the project is about cities, but it was really about, the project really started with that intention. I think that was why this book in particular felt like the most just relevant to the project. It was a really instinctive process though. I remember I was reading the book on the tube and on the metro in London, and I remember just being like, this, like, has anyone exhibited this? And I remember coming out of the station and like punching into Google like Annie Ernaux exteriors photo exhibition, because I like couldn't, it was so obvious to me, and I couldn't, and I really thought that it was going to be like, oh, the Biennale and an exhibition, you know, but it didn't. And then I sent this email to Simon, and then the MEP were really supportive of the idea, and so it was a really instinctive reaction. Yeah.
Can we have a final round of applause, please, for Lou and Laura?